Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Harvard Museum of Natural History's National Fossil Day. I'm Ariel, one of the museum educators, and it's wonderful to have all of you with us today. This afternoon, we are going to be talking to Katrina Jones and Meg Whitney. Katrina, could you give us a wave? Hi, Katrina. Katrina is a research associate in Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology and a member of the Stephanie Pierce Lab of Vertebrate Paleontology. All right, and Meg, can you give us a wave? Hi, Meg. Meg is a postdoctoral fellow also in the Stephanie Pierce Lab. And today, they're going to be inviting us to become fossil detectives and see how fossils can help us understand how ancient animals lived, grew, and moved. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about how this webinar will work. If you haven't been in a webinar before, this might look a little different than the Zoom that you're used to. The biggest difference is that you can see us, but we can't see you, which means if you want to talk to us or let us know what you're thinking, you can use the question and answer feature. And I know that a lot of you have already used that question and answer feature, and we'll be looking at your questions soon. You are welcome to ask questions at any time. And if someone has asked a question that you really like, you can let us know by clicking the little thumbs up icon next to that question, and that'll upvote the question and let us know you really want us to answer it. So now we'd like to learn a little bit more about you. We have a quick poll to find out who is watching today. So our poll question is, who is watching? And you can answer just me, a fossil-loving kid, just me, a fossil-loving grown-up, a whole family of fossil lovers, or a classroom of fossil lovers. We'll give everyone just a minute or two to answer that. Wow, we have a lot of people in this webinar. That's very exciting. Oh, so we've got a great group of people here today. We have a lot of kids. We have a lot of classrooms, a few families, and a few grown-ups. Wonderful. And now we have one last poll question for you, and it's to vote for your favorite one of these fossils. So we're going to give you 4 possibilities to vote for, and you can choose which one you like the best. And your choices are a T-Rex, a Dimetrodon, a woolly mammoth, a pterodactyl, or a Kronosaurus. Oh, I can see all the results coming in. And we'll show you those results in just a minute so you can see how everyone voted. Ooh, and the T-Rex is the winner, but I'm really glad to see that woolly mammoth and pterodactyl are also getting some love, so that is fantastic. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Meg and Katrina. And like I said, feel free to ask us questions as we go along. All right, take it away.
Great. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Katrina and I are going to ask you guys to help us become fossil detectives today. And that's really because being a paleontologist is all about being a detective, where we have a bunch of clues like these bones that you guys can see on your screens, where we can't go and study the animals that we work on. Instead, we have to kind of use the clues that they've left behind, which oftentimes come in the form of bones or footprints, things like that. So we have to put on our detective hats and solve some mysteries. So the first fossil mystery we're going to work together through, I'm going to work with you guys, and then I'm going to hand it over to Katrina, and she's going to work with all of you through some different fossil mysteries. So the first fossil mystery we're going to look at is really, how did dinosaurs grow? And that's because we want to understand how dinosaurs got so big. These are the largest animals that have ever walked on Earth. And so we want to understand how they got to be so ginormous. And that's also because dinosaurs started out as tiny little babies. So they would hatch out of eggs the size of grapefruits or soccer balls, and then grow up to be these massive animals that were really dominant on the terrestrial landscape for a really long time. And that's really different than anything that we see today. So the largest animals that have ever existed is the blue whale. It's about the length of 3 school buses. And they're really different from dinosaurs because they live in water, so they don't have to deal with the pressures of gravity and being on land. And in addition to that, their babies are really big. So blue whale calves are actually pretty large when they are born. And that's very different than what we see in dinosaurs that have babies that are born really small and then have to get really, really big. And so we want to understand how dinosaurs grew from being such tiny little babies to being these massive animals. And if you want to understand how an animal is growing in an animal that's alive today, you can just measure it and weigh it as the animal is growing up from a tiny little baby into an adult. And in fact, we do this, right? Every year when you go to the doctor, you get weighed, you can measure your height, and so the doctor can monitor how you're growing. We can't do that in fossils, right? These animals have been extinct for a long time. So instead, what we have to do is kind of put on our detective hats and find a different way of trying to study how they grew. And luckily for us, bones are like storybooks. And so they kind of capture a lot of information about us as we are even just sitting here during this webinar now. And so bones are organized kind of in chapters. And that's because as bone grows, it grows kind of layer by layer. And so what you're able to do is then read that storybook in a chronological order where you have information kind of as the animal was growing up, from youngest to oldest. And then within each one of these chapters, there are words that we can read. So we can look at the tiny little details that's captured in the inside of bones. So things like spaces where blood vessels sat, spaces where cells used to sit, and we can study those and within each one of these chapters, kind of understand what was going on through the animal's life. So to do this, we actually have to look inside fossil bones and we make thin sections of them. So this is a video of making a very, very, very thin slice of a fossil bone. We then put that very, very thin slice onto a glass slide and we grind it on sandpaper until it is super thin, so thin that we can put it under a microscope and a light will pass through and we can study all of the really, really small details that are captured in the bone. And so this will allow us to kind of read the story that's captured in these bones. But before we do this with fossils, we kind of have to understand what bone looks like in animals that are alive today. So we can look at 2 animals where we know what their growth looks like. We have an animal that grows really slowly, like the alligator, that becomes an adult or is fully grown in 15 years. And that's different than an emu, which grows really, really quickly. It's fully grown in 1 year. And so we can take a thin section of these animals' bones. This is what it looks like when we take a look at the inside under a microscope. And we can look at some of the features in these different bones and compare them. So in our slow growing animal, the alligator, we have these tree rings that you guys can see here that kind of wrap their way around the bone. And then we're also going to look for shapes. So we have only a few circles in this alligator. You can see they're black and kind of have this white halo around them. They're there, but there's only a few of them in this bone. So if we see tree rings and we only see a few circles, that animal's probably growing slowly like an alligator. But if we don't see any tree rings and instead we see lots of circles, just hard to see a little bit in this thin section, but you can see kind of the white dots. Occasionally they're red in this section as well. What that tells us is that the animal is growing really, really quickly. So we're going to look for tree rings and we're going to look for shapes. We're going to look for circles in cross sections in fossils and see if we can compare them to animals that we know grow slowly versus those that we know grow quickly. So we're gonna put on our fossil detective hats and solve some mysteries. So the first mystery we're gonna look at is how fast did T-Rex grow, right? You guys just told us this was your favorite fossil. So we're gonna take a look at the inside of T-Rex's bones and try to understand how this animal was growing. So this is what the inside of T-Rex's bones look like. And so the first thing, I'll give everyone a few seconds to think about it. And you have your guide on the right hand of your screen that have our slow and fast growing bones, just so we can remember. Do you guys see any tree rings? I don't see any tree rings. So we're gonna say we don't see any tree rings in this thin section. How about shapes? Do you see lots of circles or very few circles? I see lots of circles, right? All of this, there are circles everywhere in this image. And so if we think back to our alligator and our emu, this looks most like our emu, which was a fast-growing animal. So we can say that T-Rex was a fast-growing animal. If we go to our second fossil mystery, is how did baby long-necked dinosaurs grow? And this was actually a fossil mystery that we solved not that long ago. So these are real bones from a baby long-necked dinosaur from Madagascar. And we wanted to understand how that baby was growing because like I said, it had just hatched out of an egg the size of a soccer ball. And so if we take a look inside, we can see we can look for tree rings, and I kind of gave it away because I advanced too quickly. But we don't see any tree rings, right? We don't see any of those rings that wrap around. And then let's see, do you guys see any circles? I see lots of circles. They're much smaller in this one, but if you look really closely, you can see lots of circles all over the inside of this long-necked dinosaur's bones. And so just like the T-Rex, this baby sauropod was growing really, 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 really quickly. And so if we go back to our original question, how did dinosaurs get so big? They grew really, really quickly, right? Just like all of these other baby animals, they hatched out and they had to kind of get big really, really quickly and did so by having really, really elevated metabolism, something similar to like an emu today. And with that, I am going to hand things off to our next segment.
So before you hand it off, we had a few questions that you might be able to answer.
Sure.
One of them is, where do you get a T-Rex bone?
Where do you get a T-Rex bone? Actually, North America is one of the best places in the world for a T-Rex bone. So places like Montana, out west have a lot of T-Rex bones.
Wow, excellent. And before we continue, I want to let our students know we have a lot of students in different classrooms with us today. And students, you might realize that you're listed as your teacher's name. That's just a weird thing about this webinar. We have a lot of you today, so I'm going to ask you to please use the question and answers just when you have questions and not for chatting, because that'll help us find your questions and then we'll be able to answer them better. All right, let's turn it on over to Katrina. Katrina, are you with us?
Yep, I'm with you. I'm just trying to advance the slide. There we go. Hello, everyone. My name's Katrina. I'm going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk now about how did fossils move and how can we figure that out. And the way fossils move or the way animals move is very important because, as you can see from this GIF, that's one important way in which they can catch their prey if they're a carnivorous animal. It's also a way in which animals can escape from being prey from other animals, and it's a way for them to explore new environments and access new resources. So it's a really important part of their ecology. But figuring out how animals that died millions of years ago might have moved is quite challenging. So to begin this, we're going to start with another survey. I want to know what kinds of pets does everybody have at home? So if we could pop that up really quickly. So the options are cat, dog, bird, lizard, hamster, or if you have like another kind of rodent, you can just click hamster, fish, other, or maybe you don't have a pet. So I'm just curious to know what kinds of pets everyone might have.
Interesting. I see we're getting a lot of nice results there.
Okay, here are the results. Oh, looks like dog is a pretty clear winner there, with also cat coming in second, but also a lot of people that don't have pets. Well, hopefully if you don't have a pet, you're quite familiar with what the other pets are like anyway, because pets are actually a great way of illustrating all the different ways that animals move. So, for example, we can compare the movements of our different kinds of pets. So this cat, for example, is very good at jumping and climbing on trees, whereas dogs are much better at running. Well, in most cases anyway. I'm not so sure about this one particular example, but generally dogs are very good at running. Birds are very unusual among vertebrate animals in that they can fly, which is an amazing ability. Whereas fish obviously can swim and move about really effectively in the water. And then there's this one oddball species here, humans, and we are very, very weird because we walk upright on two legs, which again is a very different way of moving. So we can see all these different ways of moving. And in order to understand how animals may have moved in the past, the only clues we have left about how they moved were their skeletons. So if we look at the skeletons of all these different animals, one thing we can actually notice is that they're made of the same constituent parts. So all of these animals, for example, have a backbone or some kind of spine. They all have a forelimb or a front limb, like arms, like our arms. And they all have some kind of hind limb. And these limbs and spine are used in locomotion, and it takes the same basic organization, and then we get what's called locomotor adaptations. And that's changes to this anatomy that might help them with their particular mode of locomotion. So I'll give you some examples. So here's our friendly household cat that we know is very good at climbing and jumping. And for example, cats have these retractable claws, which they can use for gripping on very uneven surfaces. They have extremely mobile joints, so they can maneuver and twist around. And they also have long tails, and this helps them to counterbalance as they're jumping and maneuvering. By contrast, if we look at this bird, we can look inside the bird's bones and see that the bones are very, very light and full of air, and this makes them nice and light for lifting off the ground. We can look at the bird's feathers, and we see that the feathers are actually asymmetric in shape. That means that they're not perfectly even on each side. And this means that when the air moves over the wing as they're flapping, it actually generates lift and is very important for flying. And we can see that they have this big breastbone, and this is where the big breast muscles that move the wing actually attach. So if you've ever had a roast turkey or a roast chicken, for example, on Thanksgiving Day, you know that one of the juiciest cuts is the breast meat, and that's where that attaches. So we know that there are powerful muscles there. So these are all examples of locomotor adaptations that we could potentially look out for in fossils. And so you can see understanding how living animals use their bones during locomotion is really important if we want to try and understand what fossil bones might mean. So we have some pretty cool new technology. We have some of this at Harvard for actually understanding this. This is called XROM, which is X-ray of moving morphology. And it's a way to use X-rays to actually bring bones to life in real animals. So for example, we can see this little pig here. He's chowing down on some delicious pig food. And you see those two big round structures on either side of him. Those are X-ray machines that are capturing images of the pig's skull. And then we can combine it with CT or CAT scans in order to actually animate the skull and bring it back to life. And so here we see the skull moving on top of the pig eating. And bear in mind, this isn't CGI or an artist's impression. This is real scientific data that we can take real measurements from. And so we can do something similar with locomotion. So here's a bird that's actually moving and maneuvering in quite a weird way, twisting around, and we want to understand how the different bones of the leg might be involved in this movement. So we can use this technique to watch how each individual bone contributes to this particular movement. Similarly, fossil trackways are a really good way of understanding how animals might move. And so we can use this technology to actually reconstruct how trackways might be formed. So we can see the foot delving into the sediment here, and then we can actually map out how the sediment moves and how the footprint is formed. And by understanding that, we can help to interpret different kinds of footprints we see in the fossil record. So as you can see, there's lots of ways of getting clues that might help us to understand how anatomy can be translated into understanding locomotion. So let's give it a go ourselves and become fossil detectives. And fossil mystery number 3, we're going to look at an animal called Archaeopteryx. You can see the picture of the fossil here. So it's 150 million years old, and this particular fossil was found in Germany. And we know that this is an extinct dino bird. That means it's somewhere on the lineage that is leading to birds, but birds are actually dinosaurs, so it's also related to dinosaurs. And the key question is here, you can see beautifully preserved feathers, but could this dino bird actually fly? So we can look at its skeleton image here, and we can compare it to things like extant birds. So up on the right-hand side, we can see the skeleton of a pigeon, and we can try and look for some anatomical features. So the first thing we can notice is that the feathers preserved in the fossil are asymmetric. So you remember from earlier, asymmetric feathers are very important for producing flight. So that's a good clue. However, when we look at how the shoulder is constructed, it's a lot less mobile than a lot of the living birds that we have today. So that suggests it might be doing something a little bit different. And when we look at the inside of the bone structure, we actually see instead of resembling birds that fly around a lot, it actually resembles pheasants. And so that leads to the conclusion that they may have actually been using more short distance flapping. So for example, in pheasants today, they spend most of their time on the ground, but if a predator comes or if they need to move quickly, they'll use a burst of flapping to get away. So our best guess at the moment, based on the current evidence we have, is that perhaps Archaeopteryx was doing something like this, just using flapping occasionally. Okay, on to our next fossil mystery. This fossil is called Ambulocetus. It's from 50 million years ago, and it was found in Pakistan, today's Pakistan. And we know that it's extinct, an extinct whale, so it's related to living whales, but we're not sure if it could swim. So we're going to look for some anatomical clues. Again, we're going to compare the skeleton of Ambulocetus on the left to the skeleton of living whales on the right. And you can see straight away that these skeletons are very different. First thing we can notice is that the front legs are quite flipper-like. They're sort of big and wide and flat, as we would expect to find in a flipper. And something very interesting is you notice that this animal actually had back legs. Now, if you look at the image of the whale up there, living whales don't have any back legs. So we know that it's quite different from living whales because it does have back legs. But the end of the legs are transformed into large paddle-like feet. Further, the hip joint itself is very immobile, not like, doesn't have the same degree of mobility as animals that walk around a lot on land. And so we can conclude that this animal could probably swim well, but it could also walk around on land, which obviously living whales can't do. And so we can hypothesize that maybe it was a little bit like a living seal, where it could spend time in the water hunting, but then come out on land and still move about pretty effectively. And so today we've addressed two different questions about extinct animals biology. We've asked, how do fossils grow? And Detective Meg showed you that dinosaurs likely grew very quickly to achieve their remarkably large size. And we've also asked, how did fossils move? And I've hopefully shown you that skeletal anatomy can provide really important clues about how extinct animals move. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we might be doing some questions now.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Meg. I was just about to say, come on back on the screen, and maybe we can stop sharing for a minute, stop screen sharing for a minute. And we have a lot of really great questions that people have been asking. A lot of people are interested in how you find fossils. How do you know where to look? How deep do you need to dig? And where in the world can you find them?
I guess I'll go since I'm already unmuted. The answer is you can find them in lots of different places. I would say some kind of fossil has probably been found in every country of the world. I I would say, though, that the type of fossil you find is going to depend a lot on the type of rocks that you have in that particular location. So, for example, if your rocks were forming in the deep ocean, you're more likely to get marine animals, like, for example, famous examples would be like trilobites or fossil corals, that kind of thing. And so in some ways, Meg and I work on mostly terrestrial animals. And so it's a little bit rarer to find rocks that were formed on the land, but still in an appropriate way to preserve fossils. And so those deposits tend to be a little bit rarer. But as to how you collect them, I'll pass over to Meg, because she's been doing lots of very cool fossil collecting recently.
Yeah, collecting fossils is the hard part. So we actually don't really dig. When we find a fossil, it's sticking up, and it might be a lot of the fossil, it might be a small part of the fossil, but we try to look for clues that are already exposed on the outside. And then from there, we dig them out, and that can happen a lot of different ways depending on where you are in the world. So if you're digging up fossils in places like Montana, the rocks there actually tend to be really, really beautiful and lovely to take out fossils, because it is kind of like with a brush or maybe a little chisel that you're getting the rocks out or the fossils out. But then there are other places in the world like Antarctica where we do field work, where we have to take crazy rock saws, and the rock is really, really tough. And so getting a fossil out really depends on where in the world you're taking them out from. Yeah.
Cool. So we had a question that's more for Meg, I think, and the questions were some questions about dinosaur bones. Like, how do you know that what you see inside the bone is the growth of the bone and not something that happened during the fossilization process?
That's a good question. So luckily, our bones have the same features as dinosaur bones. So they might look a little bit different because we're different animals, but the basic features are the same. So we can look at modern bones and look at the features in those bones, and then we'll see the same thing in the fossil bone. So there are definitely structures that are part of just becoming a fossil. And so we have to ignore those when we're thinking about the biology and reading that story. But a lot of the structures in there are the same structures that are in our bones.
Interesting. And another question for you, Meg, was what about dinosaurs that ate plants? How were they able to grow so fast?
This is one of the crazy mysteries we still don't know the answer to, which is why everyone should become a paleontologist and help us figure it out. So we don't know, because a lot of the plants that are really, really nutrient rich evolved later, after the dinosaurs or right at the end of dinosaurs. So we don't really know. There must have been some plants that provided the nutrients that these animals needed to get so big so quickly. Yeah, it's one of the great mysteries.
Another good question we have some people who are wondering a little bit about dinosaur evolution. In particular, are lizards more related to dinosaurs than birds? And either of you, I think, could answer that one.
So actually, birds are more closely related to dinosaurs. Actually, birds are dinosaurs. So the way we think about evolution is in terms of trees. So in terms of thinking each animal has a last common ancestor with every other animal. So we have a last common ancestor with any other animal that you can think of. And birds and dinosaurs have a more recent last common ancestor than do dinosaurs with lizards. So they're all in a group called archosaurs, and that also includes crocodiles and things like that.
Nice. We also had someone ask about, if you're a paleontologist and you're uncovering a scary dinosaur, do you ever get scared?
All the time. You get especially afraid that you're going to break it if it's so scary looking.
And another question about dinosaurs, someone actually emailed us this question ahead of time because they were very interested in it, and they wanted to know, do dinosaurs have kneecaps?
That's a really great question. There's actually somebody who was recently a researcher in our lab who was very interested in kneecaps. And I'll be honest with you, I'm actually not sure what the answer is, because I know that as part of her research, she found that kneecaps had evolved lots of different times. And that they were actually in a lot of animals where they hadn't really been noticed or recorded in the past, because there are a lot of animals that aren't studied as well or as thoroughly as, say, for example, humans are studied. But kneecaps are unusual because they're a special bone that forms within tissue. And it's thought that actually the mechanical stress on the tissue helps to generate the bone being formed. So that kind of bone is called a sesamoid bone. And so sesamoids evolve all over the place very convergently. So I can't give you a specific answer for dinosaurs, but I can tell you it's a very interesting and unusual bone that's evolved in lots of different animals.
That's excellent. And I know we are almost out of time, so I think we have time for one more question. And I think a lot of people might be wondering, do you have a favorite fossil?
Well, I was sad to see Dimetrodon did not get very much love at the beginning of this, but Dimetrodon is one of my favorite fossils. It's in my home. So yes, that's one of my favorites.
Wonderful. What about you, Katrina? Do you have a favorite one?
I mean, there are lots of cool fossils, but I do think the Ambulocetus fossil that I showed the images of in my talk is one of my favorite fossils because it's a whale that walks. And what's not to love about that?
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Katrina and Meg. It was wonderful talking with you today. And thank you to our wonderful audience. I know you had a lot more questions that we didn't get to today, but I want to thank you for asking all of these wonderful questions. And if you're interested in other virtual events like this, take a look at our website. We have some more coming up. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.